I never thought a camping trip could teach me one of the most specific life lessons I'd ever learn. Never drink tea given to you by a man with the name of an animal. Cheetah, tiger, bobcat, it doesn't matter. If his name sounds like he belongs in a zoo, keep walking. It started the first week of October. I'd taken a week off work to clear my head. I was burnt out, barely sleeping, barely eating, and snapping at people for no good reason. I needed to be alone. No phone, no laptop, no meetings. Just me, a tent, a fire, and maybe some cold air to scrape the stress off my bones. I chose a semi-remote spot about 3 hours from where I lived. It wasn't backcountry level, but it was quiet. A national forest with some less traveled trails. Not exactly uncharted territory, but far enough from the weekend crowds that I could pretend I was alone in the world for a while. I packed heavy, extra clothes, a proper sleeping pad, and enough food to last me a week. I brought my old gas stove, water filter, and a tarp. I even brought a good folding chair so I wouldn't have to sit on wet logs. When I got there, I parked the car off a dirt road and hiked a couple miles in, far enough to feel isolated but not stupid about it. I knew the area well enough to respect it but not fear it. I'd camped alone plenty of times before. The first 2 days were exactly what I needed. I spent most of my time boiling water for coffee, sitting by the fire, or walking the trails without a destination. I didn't see anyone, not a soul. There were signs people had passed through recently. A few footprints in soft dirt, some stripped branches, but I didn't think anything of it. By the 3rd day, I'd fallen into a rhythm. Get up when it got light, brew coffee, sit and watch the mist burn off the trees, go for a long walk, come back, cook dinner, crawl into the sleeping bag when it got dark, sleep deeper than I had in months. I didn't miss the noise of daily life. Felt good to disappear. That's when I first noticed him. It was late in the afternoon. I just finished a short hike and returned to camp when I saw a figure walking along the ridge maybe 50 yards above me. Just a quick flash of motion between the trees. He wasn't close, but close enough to make out the shape of a man carrying a pack, wearing something brown or camo-colored. He didn't stop or look at me, just moved along and disappeared back into the woods. I didn't think much of it at first. People came through here all the time. Just because I hadn't seen anyone didn't mean no one else was around. I figured he was another loner doing the same thing I was. That night, though, I had a hard time sleeping. It wasn't fear, not exactly. Just that nagging awareness that I wasn't truly alone anymore. Every crack of a branch or rustle in the brush pulled me halfway out of sleep. I lay there with my ears straining for patterns in the noise, trying to convince myself it was just raccoons or deer. The next morning, I found something that changed the tone of the trip. My tarp had been moved. Not a lot, just shifted like someone had grabbed one corner and dragged it a few feet before changing their mind. I'd staked it well the night before. There hadn't been any wind. The stakes were still in the ground, but the tarp had been unhooked and dragged. I checked my gear. Nothing was missing. No signs of animals. Just that quiet suggestion that someone had come into my camp while I slept and left without taking anything. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I hadn't staked it as tight as I thought. Maybe I pulled it out when I stepped on it half asleep last night. I shrugged it off. But from that moment on, I couldn't relax. That afternoon, I saw him again. This time closer. I was coming back from gathering firewood when he stepped into my camp like he belonged there. He was lean, maybe in his late 40s, with long gray hair tied back behind his head. Wore a dirty canvas jacket, cargo pants, and a baseball cap with a faded hunting logo on it. His boots were muddy, his hands dirty. His face was tan and leathery, like he spent most of his life outdoors. He had a small tin cup in one hand and a metal thermos in the other. He smiled like we were old friends. I didn't say anything. I didn't even have time to process the fact that he was there before he held out the tin cup. He held it out like it was a gift, like I was supposed to be grateful. I didn't take it. I just stood there, not smiling back, waiting for him to explain himself. He looked down at the cup, then back at me, then sipped it himself. Then he pointed to his chest and said, "Bobcat." No context, no introduction, just that word, Bobcat. He smiled again, took another sip, and left. just walked out of my camp like nothing had happened. I stood there long after he disappeared, heart beating fast, trying to piece it together. The name stuck in my mind like a fishhook. Bobcat. Who the hell introduces themselves like that? Why did he bring tea? Why didn't he say anything else? And why did he come from the same direction I'd seen that figure walking a few days ago? That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up, fire burning low, holding my hatchet in my lap. I heard footsteps at one point, soft, deliberate, passing near the camp but not entering it. I sat there in total darkness, barely breathing, the fire down to embers, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did, but I knew he'd been close. The next morning, I made the decision to pack up early. I'd only been there 4 days. I planned to stay a week, but my gut told me it was time to go. I couldn't explain it. Nothing dramatic had happened, but the air felt wrong. That guy hadn't hurt me, hadn't even said much, but I knew I needed to leave. Instinct's a real thing, and mine was blaring like a siren. As I packed, I found something that confirmed my decision. A second tin cup, sitting next to my tent, just barely hidden under the edge of the rainfly, full of tea, still warm. He'd been there again. I didn't touch it, just looked at it for a long time. The cup was dented, old, same type he'd held yesterday. It meant he'd come back in the night and left it as a gift, or maybe a message. I left it there. I broke camp faster than I ever had before. Didn't bother to eat, just stuffed everything into my pack and started walking. I didn't take the trail I'd come in on. I made a new path, straight over the ridge, through the brush, down toward the road. I figured even if it took longer, it was better than risking walking into him again. I was maybe an hour into the hike when I smelled smoke. Not campfire smoke, something thicker. Burning plastic. I came around a bend and saw a small clearing where someone had made a fire. Trash was smoldering in it, cans, plastic wrappers, bits of foam. Someone had been living there. There were signs of long-term use. A lean-to made of branches. A pile of bones, small animals, maybe squirrels or rabbits. Tarp with dark stains on it. Piles of wrappers from cheap snack food. A 5-gallon jug of water half full. And another thermos. The same kind Bobcat had. There were also photos. Actual printed photos, stuck in the branches of a tree. Faces of men. All of them looking straight at the camera. None smiling. One of them was me. Stopped me cold. I looked closer. My photo, same clothes I'd been wearing 2 days earlier. Taken from a distance, maybe with a long lens. I hadn't even known anyone was nearby. I didn't wait. I ran. I left the trail, moved downhill, fast and careless, tripping over roots and crashing through brush. I didn't care about noise anymore. I just wanted out. I made it back to my car by late afternoon. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely unlock the door. I didn't even check to see if anyone had messed with the car. I just threw my gear in the back and drove. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station an hour later and locked myself in the bathroom for 10 minutes just to breathe. I didn't go to the police. What would I say? A guy named Bobcat gave me tea and took my picture? There wasn't a crime, not exactly. Just a feeling, a warning, a brush with something I didn't understand. But I kept the memory like a scar. That night, after I got home, I poured out all the tea I had in my own cupboard. Felt like a ritual, like closing a door. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not for a long time, but the rule stuck. Never drink tea given to you by a man with the name of an animal. Because sometimes people like that don't want to hurt you, not right away. They want to mark you, get you comfortable, see how close they can get. They want to know if you'll drink what they give you, if you'll sit down and share something warm, if you'll let them in. And if you do, they won't go away. They'll come back, again and again, until you don't leave, until you become the next face on the tree. We talked about doing it for months. It was one of those things that started as a joke during a late-night hangout. Camping in the woods, no phones, no plans, and bringing shrooms to get in touch with nature. Whatever that meant. At the time, it sounded like a wild, fun idea. One of those stories you'd look back on when you're older, shake your head, and laugh about. But now, when I think about that weekend, There's nothing funny about it. I wish we'd just stayed home. I wish we hadn't taken them. I wish I hadn't seen what I saw. Most of all, I wish I could forget how real everything felt. There were 4 of us. Me, Mark, Dylan, and Ethan. We'd known each other since high school, and even though we were all a few years out and moving in different directions, we still made time to hang out every few months. This camping trip was supposed to be one of those moments before life pulled us apart again. We picked a spot that wasn't on any official trail, just some area deep in the woods upstate, where Ethan said his cousin used to hunt. It was off the grid, no service, and far enough from anything that we wouldn't run into other campers. That was the idea. No people, no noise, no distractions. Just the 4 of us, the woods, a campfire, and some mushrooms in a Ziploc bag. We arrived early Friday afternoon, parked the car where the dirt road ended, threw on our backpacks, and started hiking. The trail wasn't marked, but Ethan seemed to know the way. The hike was longer than expected, close to 2 hours, but when we finally reached a small clearing near a shallow creek, we knew we'd found the right spot. It was flat, open enough to set up camp, and had a good view of the trees around us without feeling too exposed. The first night was perfect. We set up our tents, built a fire, cooked some food, and just sat around talking. It was quiet, so quiet it almost felt fake. No buzzing of traffic, no hum of streetlights, just the occasional rustle of wind through trees and the crackle of the fire. We stayed up late, drinking a bit and passing around a small joint Dylan had brought. The shrooms were saved for the next night. We didn't want to rush it. Saturday started lazy. We slept in, made breakfast over the fire, and spent most of the day lounging by the creek. There wasn't much to do, and that was the whole point. Around mid-afternoon, we decided to split a bit of firewood and get everything ready before we took the mushrooms. I remember looking up at the sky then, clear blue, not a cloud, and thinking, it's going to be a good night. We waited until just before sunset. The bag of mushrooms got passed around. We each took a dose that Ethan said was chill but strong. He said he'd done them before and that we'd peak just after dark, then settle into a calm, trippy headspace. I didn't know much about how they worked. I just trusted the guys and figured it'd be a little weird, maybe a little funny. I was wrong. The first hour was harmless enough. The trees started to look more alive, like they were breathing with the wind. Colors felt deeper. The crackling of the fire had a rhythm to it that felt almost musical. I remember sitting there and thinking it was all going great. Then I started feeling strange. At first, it was just a twist in my stomach. Not quite pain, just wrong. Then my sense of time started slipping. I'd blink, and the fire would look completely different. 1 second it would be bright and clear, the next it was dim and smoldering like hours had passed. I looked at the guys to see if they noticed, but everything felt disconnected. Mark was staring off into the trees like he was hypnotized. Dylan was lying on his back, laughing at nothing. Ethan was crouched near the edge of the woods, mumbling something to himself. I couldn't hear anything clearly. It was like being stuck behind glass. That's when the fear hit me. Not panic, not yet. Just this creeping, slow dread that started at the base of my spine and moved up. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like something was watching us from the trees. I tried to shake it off, told myself it was just the mushrooms messing with me. But the feeling didn't go away. The trees looked wrong, not just alive, wrong. Tall and narrow and stretched too far, leaning inward like they were closing in. I knew it was the trip, but knowing didn't help. I remember standing up and feeling like the ground was pulling me downward, like my boots were sinking into it even though I was standing on dry dirt. I tried to sit by the fire again, but it didn't feel safe. The light flickered too fast, and the shadows danced like people moving just out of reach. Every noise felt too loud, branches cracking, leaves rustling, the occasional snap that echoed like a gunshot. My heart wouldn't slow down. I felt like I was being hunted. Then I saw Ethan. He was crouched by a tree about 20 feet away, staring at the ground like he was tracking something. I could barely see him, but something about his body language was off. He wasn't swaying or stumbling like the rest of us. He looked still, tense, like an animal ready to pounce. I turned to say something to Mark, but he was gone. I don't mean he wandered off, I mean I turned, and the space where he'd been was empty. I didn't even hear him leave. Panic hit me full force then. My brain couldn't piece it together. 1 second he was there, the next he wasn't. I yelled his name, but it came out garbled, like I was underwater. Dylan sat up and looked around like he'd just woken up from a dream, but I couldn't read his face. Everything was distorted. I started walking toward the tree line, not toward Ethan, just away from the fire. I needed to get away from it, from everything. I don't know how far I walked. The woods felt endless. Every step was heavy, like I was wading through mud. The trees blurred together. I started hearing things. My own voice echoing back at me, branches snapping in every direction, whispers that had no source. At one point, I saw what I thought was a deer, just a flash of white in the trees. But when I looked closer, it was gone. I wasn't sure if I'd seen it at all. Eventually, I fell, just crumpled to the ground like my legs stopped working, curled up, trying to breathe. That's when the trip turned from terrifying to something worse. This overwhelming sense that I was dying. I couldn't tell if I was asleep or awake. I kept seeing images I couldn't explain. A hand reaching out of the dirt, eyes watching me from inside tree trunks, my own face staring back at me from the shadows. And through all of it, I kept hearing something behind me, a slow, steady crunch of leaves, like someone was walking in a circle around me, never getting closer, never stopping. I don't know how long I stayed there. Eventually, I passed out. When I woke up, it was cold and gray. The sun was just coming up. Everything was quiet again. My body hurt all over. My clothes were damp. My mouth was dry. My head felt like it had been crushed in a vice. I had no idea where I was. I stood up and just started walking in what I hoped was the right direction. It took nearly an hour, but I finally found the campsite. It was a mess. The fire was out, our gear was scattered. Dylan was asleep in one of the tents, curled up in a ball like a scared kid. Ethan was sitting by the creek, knees tucked to his chest, staring at the water. Mark wasn't there. We searched for him most of the day, called his name until our voices were raw. We found his jacket by the edge of the clearing. Nothing else. We hiked back out in silence. When we got to the car, no one said anything. The drive back was even worse. I dropped them off one by one and went straight home, locked my door, and didn't come out for 2 days. It's been almost a year now. Mark was never found. The official report said he likely got lost while under the influence. They searched the area for days. Nothing. No sign of him. Not even footprints. I still see him sometimes. Not in real life, just in dreams. Standing at the edge of the woods, half-shadowed, never saying anything. I still don't know what was real that night and what wasn't. But I know one thing for sure, bad mushroom trips are hell. And doing it in the middle of the woods, far from anyone who can help you, that's a mistake you only make once. The rest of us haven't spoken since that trip. Not because we're angry. I think we just don't know how to talk about it. Maybe we're all trying to forget. But I don't think any of us ever will. I sure as hell won't. I haven't been back in the woods since. I don't plan to. Not ever. I used to go camping all the time. I don't even remember when it started. Probably sometime in high school, just tagging along with buddies who thought the woods were the best place to drink cheap beer and pretend to be grown-ups. But I kept at it long after they lost interest. Something about being out there away from everything always felt right. It wasn't even about the quiet. It was just the simplicity of it. Packing a bag, pitching a tent, setting up near a stream or tucked into a thick stand of pine. Something about it made sense. No phone, no noise, just you and whatever was out there. I never had any bad experiences at first. I knew the basics. Don't leave food out. Know where the sun sets. Respect the wildlife. I treated the woods with a kind of cautious respect, and it felt like they returned the favor. Even when I went solo, which was most of the time, it was never scary. Not in that irrational way. There were a few weird nights here and there, noises I couldn't explain, rustles that got a little too close, but nothing more than that. Then I went camping with Darren and Nick. That was the last time I really camped. We were all in our late 20s. Darren was the kind of guy who dove headfirst into anything that might spark a good story. Nick was more reserved, more cautious, but he had a quiet, stubborn streak that meant he rarely said no to things. I was somewhere in the middle. I didn't need chaos, but I didn't mind things getting weird once in a while, as long as I felt like I could get out of it okay. We went upstate, deep into a national forest that I'd camped in before. I'd never gone as far in as we did that time, but I figured it would be fine. We parked at a tiny dirt pull-off that barely fit the car and hiked about 7 miles in. The trees were dense, tall, mostly pine and spruce, with patches of hardwood here and there. No marked trails, just game paths and old logging roads. No cell signal either, but I'd brought a paper map and a compass like I always did. I logged our location in a little notepad I carried, just in case. We set up camp on the edge of a long clearing. It looked like it had been a small logging area once, maybe a decade or two ago. There were low stumps at one end, and the grass had grown back patchy and uneven. It was quiet. Too quiet, maybe, but I didn't think much of it. No wind, no birds, just that kind of stillness you only get way out, where everything feels far from everything else. We got the tent set up, got a fire going, cooked some foil packet meals. Darren pulled out a plastic bag of mushrooms. I knew what they were as soon as I saw them. He said they were strong but clean. No weird trips, he said. Just a good, long ride. I didn't really want to, but I also didn't want to be the one guy sitting out while the others were laughing their asses off watching stars spin. We ate them just after sunset. First, nothing happened. That's always how it starts. You wait, you think nothing's coming, then it hits in waves. The trees start to breathe a little. The shadows take on depth they didn't have before. Everything feels like it's pulsing, like the whole forest is inhaling with you. I was still calm at that point. I've tripped before. I knew how to let it pass over me, not fight it. But it didn't pass. Within 30 minutes, I was caught in it hard. The darkness outside the firelight felt like a wall. I kept thinking I could hear footsteps beyond it. Not one set, dozens. Crunching in the undergrowth. Fast, then nothing, then again. My heart started beating harder than it should have. I tried closing my eyes, but that made it worse. Shapes, flashes of red. I could swear I heard my name whispered in the static of the fire crackle, but I kept telling myself it was nothing. Just noise, just my brain throwing stuff at me. I looked for Darren and Nick. Couldn't find them. They were there 1 second, gone the next. Not like they walked away. Like the world had shifted and I'd fallen through to a different version of it without them. I stood up too fast. Everything tilted. My legs felt too long. I couldn't tell if I was 6 feet tall or 60. I stumbled into the trees. I don't know why. I think I thought I saw someone out there. I wanted to ask if they'd seen my friends, like I was at a party and got separated. I kept walking. No flashlight, just the moon and my warped senses. The trees started looking too similar. I would pass a split-trunked pine, then another, then the same one again. I started panicking. It was deep and quiet and wrong out there. Every few steps I'd hear a sudden burst of movement behind me, like someone darting just out of view. I couldn't turn fast enough to catch it. I started running. Branches caught my arms, whipped my face. I slipped on damp leaves and fell hard. Got the wind knocked out of me. I don't know how long I lay there. Eventually, things softened just enough for me to crawl to a tree and lean against it. I was shivering, not from the cold, just from the total loss of control. I kept thinking, you did this to yourself, but the thought didn't help. It just echoed in my skull, like it wasn't mine anymore. I passed out or maybe just shut down for a while. When I came to, it was still dark but quieter inside me. The forest looked less like a maze and more like, well, a forest again. I still couldn't see the stars, but I could tell the trip was fading. I didn't know where I was. I stood up and tried to find the clearing. I walked for what felt like hours. No landmarks, no sounds from my friends, just this dead hush. Finally, I caught a glint of metal, Nick's tent poles. Relief hit so hard I almost threw up. The fire was out. Darren was sitting with his back against a log, head in his hands. He looked pale, gaunt. His eyes were sunken, like he hadn't slept in days. I sat down near him but didn't say anything. We just sat there in the dead quiet until the sky started to turn gray. Nick showed up a little after dawn, limping, mud streaked all over his face and hands. He didn't say where he went. I didn't ask. None of us talked much that morning. We packed everything in silence. No one wanted to stay another second. The hike out was the worst part. Every twig snap behind us sent shivers down my spine. My muscles were wrecked from tension. I kept thinking about how far we were from the car, how deep in we'd gone. What if we never found the road? What if we circled back to the clearing again by mistake? We made it back to the car. The trailhead looked alien, like a snapshot from a dream. I drove. No one said a word the whole ride home. That trip changed something in me. It wasn't just the mushrooms. It was the loss of control. The way the forest felt alive, but not in a poetic way. In a watching, waiting way. I'd been in those woods so many times before and never felt it. But that night, it was like the whole place leaned in and reminded me how small I was. I haven't been camping since. I think about it, sure. Sometimes I even pull out my gear, check it over, feel that itch in the back of my mind that says, maybe it's safe now, but I can't trust the quiet anymore. Not like I used to. And the worst part is, I don't even know what happened to Darren or Nick out there. Not really. We never talked about it. Never shared stories. It was like we all agreed, silently, that whatever happened that night was something we'd leave behind in the trees. But every so often, I'll see a certain kind of light through the branches, or smell pine sap on a hot day, and it comes rushing back. The shadows, the shapes, the absolute certainty that I wasn't alone out there, even when I was. No fairy tales, no monsters, just your own mind turning against you in a place where nothing will come to help. That's enough for me. More than enough. I don't need to go back to remember how it felt. I never need to go back at all. I don't know if it's some part of getting older or if it's just how the mind works, but there are some moments in life that seem to get louder over time. Not because they were the most dramatic or the flashiest, but because they shook something inside of you in a quiet, deep way that keeps echoing back years later. That backpacking trip in the Sawtooths was one of those moments for me. It's been years now, and I still think about it. Not every day, not in some traumatic way, but often enough that I know I'll never forget it. It was midsummer, and 3 of us had taken a week off to hit the trails in the Sawtooth Wilderness in Idaho. It was one of those trips where we wanted to go light but deep, pack in just the essentials, head off the beaten path, and find some true quiet. The kind of trip where you don't see another soul for days. We were well into our route when we set up camp that night, down in a valley where 2 steep, rocky walls sloped up on either side. The kind of place where your voice echoes off the cliffs and dies quickly in the thick air. The valley had a kind of cathedral silence to it. During the day, it was beautiful. Sunlight streaming in at a hard angle in the early morning, catching the tops of the cliffs before anything below warmed up. At night, though, the mood changed. That silence became heavier. We'd made camp on a flat patch near a narrow creek, just a little above the waterline where it stayed dry. The terrain was mostly rock and thin soil with patches of stiff alpine grass. You could tell the place didn't get many visitors. We ate a basic dinner and turned in early. The 3 of us were spread out a little bit, maybe 20 feet between tents, just far enough to feel alone in our own little pockets of fabric. I remember laying down, still warm from moving around and organizing gear, and trying to sink into sleep while my mind ran through the usual checklist. Was the bear canister secure? Were we on stable ground? Did I check for widowmakers overhead? I always did this mental rundown when camping, especially in remote places. It's a way to calm myself, to let my brain confirm that everything that can be done has been done. Eventually, the running thoughts quieted and I drifted off. It was sometime deep into the night when I woke up. It wasn't the normal slow rise from a dream. It was sharp, instant, like flipping a switch. Something had pulled me out of sleep hard. For a second, I just lay there listening. The tent was dark. I couldn't hear anything beyond the normal stillness, but my heart was already going. There was that low-level dread you sometimes get when you wake up in the wilderness and can't immediately place what's wrong. Then it started. It was a deep, grinding noise at first, like something big moving over stone. Not fast, not a crash, just a distant, dragging growl. I held my breath and focused. Came again, louder, and then I knew what it was. Rocks, big ones, moving. At first it sounded far up the wall of the valley, high up near the ridgeline. The kind of sound that starts and stops, then starts again harder, like something shifting and settling before it finally gives way. And then the crashing began. It wasn't a full-on landslide, at least not one that brought the entire mountainside down. But it was big. I could hear massive chunks of rock bouncing off ledges, tumbling faster and faster, building force. Trees were snapping. You could hear it, wet cracks, and then the thud of weight slamming into the ground. Something massive was coming down somewhere above us, and it was getting closer by the second. I just lay there frozen in the tent. It's strange what goes through your head in a moment like that. I didn't panic, not exactly, but I was aware of how little control I had. The first thought was to get out, to run, but I hesitated. It was pitch black, no moon, just blackness pressing against the walls of the tent like a weight. If I got out, I wouldn't be able to see a thing. And even if I could, what would I do? Where would I go? I had no idea where the rocks were falling or where they might end up. There's a kind of helplessness that comes from knowing that nothing you do is going to change what happens next. That night, I felt it more clearly than I ever had before. I remember pressing my hands flat against the ground on either side of me, as if bracing for impact would somehow help. The crashing was so loud now, so close, it felt like it was right on top of us. I imagined a boulder the size of a pickup truck barreling down and crushing everything in its path, including the thin little sheet of nylon over my head. But I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't scream. I didn't even sit up. I just lay there, heart hammering, waiting for it to either stop or hit. It sounds ridiculous now, but in that moment, it felt like staying still was my only chance. Maybe the rock would miss me. Maybe it wouldn't come this far. Maybe I'd picked the right spot without even knowing it. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound began to fade. The last of the rocks bounced and slid to a stop somewhere far down in the valley, maybe along the creek. The trees stopped snapping. The echoes died against the cliffs. And then there was nothing again. Not even wind. Just silence. I didn't fall back asleep. I just lay there, listening to the blood pounding in my ears. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember was light starting to filter through the tent walls. Morning had come, and with it, a kind of brittle stillness. Everything looked the same at first glance. No massive boulder had crushed me in the night. My tent was still upright. The creek still trickled nearby. When I stepped outside, the others were already up. No one said anything, we didn't need to. We all looked the same. Pale, tired, wide-eyed. Each of us had heard it. Each of us had waited it out. We split up and walked the valley floor for a while, looking for signs of where the rocks had come down. But it was hard to tell. There were some fresh marks on the cliffs, some disturbed soil and snapped branches off in the distance. But we couldn't find anything big or clear. For all we knew, the worst of it had stopped a quarter-mile uphill just out of sight. Still, the damage in my head had already been done. That feeling of being pinned in a narrow valley, hemmed in by steep rock faces, knowing that at any moment tons of stone could be ripping down toward you, that didn't go away with the sunrise, stuck with me. That helplessness wasn't something you could walk off with breakfast and coffee. We kept moving that day, packed up camp and continued down the trail. But every sound after that made me tense. Every shifting pebble underfoot, every gust of wind rattling a tree limb, it all triggered something. Couldn't relax. Not completely. Not for the rest of that trip. When I got home, I kept thinking about it. I looked up rockfall statistics. I read geology articles. I tried to figure out how common it really was and what the odds were of being hit. But the numbers didn't matter. It wasn't about odds. It was about how powerless I'd felt in that tent, with no idea if I'd make it through the next minute. And I've camped since then, more than a few times, but I've never set up in a valley like that again. I pick higher ground now. I look at the slope angles, the rock formations, the tree lines. I check topo maps more carefully. I read the terrain like my life depends on it, because out there, sometimes it does. That night in the Sawtooths didn't leave any scars. No one got hurt. No tents were flattened. But it changed the way I see things. Nature doesn't care if you're careful. It doesn't care if you're experienced or prepared. Sometimes, all you can do is pick your spot, stay still, and hope that the mountain decides to spare you. I don't think I'll ever forget the sound of those rocks. It wasn't just noise, it was weight, force, inevitability. It was the sound of something ancient and indifferent moving through the world. And me, small and fragile, lying there with nothing but thin fabric between me and it. That sound is still somewhere in the back of my mind. And every time I set up camp, especially when I'm far from anywhere, I think about that night. I don't think I could stop if I tried. I've always been a dog person, not in the casual let them on the couch kind of way, but in the full-blown plan my life around my dog kind of way. My German Shepherd, Scout, has been with me since he was a puppy. He's 7 now, big, quiet, alert. He's never barked much, never chewed anything up, never growled at a soul unless I gave him a reason to. Best trail dog I ever met. Never needs a leash, doesn't chase after animals, always watches me like I'm the only thing that matters. I took him on a camping trip last September. It was just us. I'd had a rough few months, work stress, a breakup that ended in cold silence, the usual stuff that makes you want to disappear for a bit. I packed up my truck with a small tent, supplies for a week, and drove north. I wasn't going anywhere special, just a spot I found on satellite maps. No name, no campsite, no road, just forest. We parked where the dirt road ended and hiked in maybe 4 or 5 miles. The trail was barely visible most of the way, just old logging ruts and animal tracks. We passed no one. I set up camp near a cold, shallow creek, backed up against a rise of rock and trees. Scout paced the perimeter like he always did, then laid down on the flat patch of dirt next to my tent like he owned it. The first few days were perfect. I did nothing but walk, cook, sit by the water, and sleep. Scout kept close. He'd wander just far enough to sniff trees and chase smells, then come trotting back. Every night, he curled up beside the fire and watched the dark like it was his job. I trusted him more than my own ears out there. On the 4th morning, I noticed something strange. We woke up early. It was still misty and damp, and Scout stood just outside the tent, frozen. He was looking into the woods to the west, ears up, not moving, tail stiff. He didn't growl, didn't whine, just stared. I stepped out, looked in the same direction. Nothing, just trees. But something felt off. The silence was heavy. No birds, no chipmunks rustling, just Scout and me and stillness. Then he let out this low, slow breath and came back to me. I didn't think much of it. Maybe he saw a deer, maybe a bear in the distance. That afternoon, I found a small pile of rocks stacked neatly by a tree about 50 yards from camp. I didn't build it. I'd been in that area every day. It hadn't been there before. I left it alone. The next night, Scout woke me up. Not with barking. He never barked unless it was serious, but by pressing his nose to my arm and nudging. When I sat up, he was staring at the wall of the tent. Again, that same direction. I unzipped the flap slowly. Scout leaned past me, nose in the air. A light flickered in the trees. Not a fire, a flashlight. Someone was walking out there, maybe 100 feet away, weaving between trunks. I couldn't see a face, just the beam bouncing. It moved slow, too slow. Not like someone hiking, like someone scanning. We stayed dead still. The light disappeared after a few minutes. I sat there for a long time, Scout at my side, both of us wide awake. I kept thinking, why would someone be out here in the middle of nowhere, no trail, no campsite, walking around at 3 a.m.? In the morning, I found another rock pile, this one closer. Different shape. Wieder, flatter. I kicked it over. I didn't like it. That evening, I decided to pack up and hike closer to the road. I wasn't scared exactly, but I wasn't going to pretend everything was normal either. Took me a couple hours to repack and hike back down the way we came. I found a spot by a bend in the trail and made a small fire. No tent, just a tarp and my sleeping bag. I figured I'd leave at first light. Scout wouldn't sit. He kept walking the edge of the light, ears up, body stiff. Every few minutes, he'd pause and stare off into the woods. No barking, just waiting. Then I heard it. A twig snapped, then another, then silence. Scout stepped between me and the trees. That's when I realized it wasn't just one person. There were at least two. I couldn't see them, but the sounds were spread out, slow, deliberate steps from different angles. My fire crackled too loud. My breath felt too heavy. Scout growled low and deep. Then someone whistled, short and sharp. I stood up, held my knife, didn't speak, didn't move. Scout lunged forward and barked. Once, loud and angry, then all the sounds stopped. No more movement, no more whistles, nothing. We stayed like that until sunrise. Whoever it was, they never came closer. I don't know what they wanted, but I had a bad feeling they weren't lost hikers. And they weren't campers. They'd been watching us. For days, probably. Maybe from the moment we got there. We hiked back to the truck without stopping. Scout didn't leave my side. When we got to the lot, there was an old SUV parked nearby. No plates. I didn't stop to look. The weird part? A week later, back home, someone left a note on my apartment door. No envelope, just a folded piece of paper that said, "What kind of magical dog do you have that everyone wants?" That was it. I moved 2 months later. Different city. Scout's still with me. Still quiet, still alert. I don't go camping anymore. I don't know what they wanted. But whatever it was, I know it had something to do with him. And I don't think they're done looking. We were 2 days into the jungle, somewhere in the Petén region of northern Guatemala, when things started to feel strange. My girlfriend and I had planned this trip for a while. 3 days of hiking through the jungle to reach Tikal, camping at a couple of ranger outposts along the way. We'd done our research, read the blogs, packed what we thought was everything we might need. I'd been in remote places before, in Central America and other parts of the world, but there's something about the jungle that closes in around you. The canopy, the damp air, the endless layers of plant life. Everything is louder, closer, more alive. The first night we camped at a basic ranger camp, just a cleared out space in the trees with a few logs around a stone fire ring. There was an old wooden hut used for storage, some rusted metal drums that collected rainwater, and a long drop toilet set back behind a row of bushes. It didn't feel like anyone else had been there in a while. There were no rangers when we arrived, just a few signs in Spanish with faded lettering, nailed into crooked trees. Still, we were fine. We pitched our tent, ate a simple meal, and lay back listening to the endless buzz of insects. Sleep came slowly. The jungle is never quiet, but it came. The second day was longer. The trail was barely marked, just faint paths beaten into the undergrowth. There were sections where we had to cut through overgrowth with a cheap machete we bought in Flores. Sweat soaked through our shirts within an hour. We drank so much water we both worried we'd run out. Around midday, the sky started to shift. The air got heavier. That afternoon we reached the second campsite, which was even more remote than the first. No huts, no signs. Just a cleared patch near a dry creek and a few rocks that might have once made up a fire pit. I remember setting up the tent under a thick old tree with a wide canopy. It seemed like a good choice at the time. It would keep the rain off if the storm came. The soil was soft but not muddy. We laid out the sleeping bags, had some canned food, and boiled water from our portable filter. The heat was stifling. The air barely moved, like the jungle was holding its breath. By nightfall, the sky was flashing. No thunder at first, just distant flickers of light that didn't feel connected to anything. Then the thunder came in rolling waves, deep and far away, like distant bombs. The rain started soft but steady, then grew stronger until it was coming down in thick sheets. We huddled in the tent listening to the drops pound the fabric. I checked for leaks every 10 minutes. The ground started to turn into mud underneath us, and I could feel little rivers of water pooling around the base of the tent. Still, we were dry and nothing had collapsed, so we decided to ride it out. I fell asleep at some point, though I can't remember when. It was sometime in the middle of the night when I woke up. It wasn't the rain that got me, It was voices, not shouts, not yelling, just low male voices, too low to understand, but close. I sat up immediately. My heart started racing. My first thought was that we were being robbed. The kind of remote trails we were on weren't always safe. I'd read stories, hikers being held up by guys with machetes or rifles. Some of those stories didn't end well. I unzipped the tent slowly and poked my head out. It was still raining, but not as hard as before. The trees were lit in flashes by lightning, and I could make out two shapes moving closer. Both men were carrying rifles. Not slung over their shoulders, they were holding them. Not aiming, but not casual either. I stepped out, barefoot in the mud, and stood up to meet them. I kept my hands visible and didn't say a word. I didn't want to provoke anything. They stopped a few yards away. One of them gestured toward the camp, maybe asking for shelter or signaling that they weren't trying to start trouble. But they didn't lower their weapons. I felt my stomach tighten. I told my girlfriend to stay in the tent and not come out no matter what. She didn't listen. A few seconds later, she unzipped it and stepped out behind me, pulling her rain jacket tight and scanning the scene. There was a moment where it could have gone either way. We were soaked, tired, and scared. They had guns and knew the jungle. But something shifted. Maybe it was the way we looked, two foreigners out of place and unarmed, or maybe they just weren't the type to cause trouble. One of the men slung his rifle over his back, the other followed. Their posture relaxed. They took a few more steps toward the edge of the camp and sat on a log, setting their gear down. They were hunters, locals, probably from one of the small villages near the edges of the protected zones. The rifles looked old but functional. One of them had a small pouch on his belt, and I caught the smell of dried meat or some kind of animal fat. They were soaked too, just two guys caught in the storm, trying to find somewhere dry to wait it out. We had a small pot of hot water still sitting over the camp stove. I offered them coffee from a half-empty tin. They accepted without hesitation, nodding. We didn't talk. There wasn't much need. It was the kind of silence that fills the space when everyone's just relieved something worse didn't happen. About 30 seconds later, maybe less, the wind roared louder than anything I'd heard in my life. It sounded like an avalanche made of trees. I barely had time to look up when the tree next to us cracked. It didn't splinter slowly. It exploded, a sound like a cannon going off. Then everything was chaos, branches whipping past us, a deep vibration in the ground, the trunk coming down like a hammer. It hit right where the tent was. There wasn't a second thought. The moment it landed, mud and water flew everywhere. Part of the tent was visible under the weight of the branches, but most of it was crushed flat. One of the hunters had jumped back instinctively. The other pulled his bag close and stared at the mess in disbelief. My girlfriend grabbed my arm and didn't let go. We just stood there, staring at the place we'd been sleeping not 10 minutes before. If we hadn't stepped out when we did, if I hadn't heard those voices, or if I'd dismissed them, or if I'd told her to come out later, we'd both be dead. There's no question. That tree was massive. The trunk alone would have flattened us. The sharp branches would have gone straight through the nylon walls, through our sleeping bags, through us. There would have been nothing left to save. For the rest of the night, no one slept. The storm passed not long after, as quickly as it had come. The rain eased into a light mist, and the jungle went quiet again. The hunters stayed with us. One of them helped drag the collapsed tent away from the tree. The other gathered what few items hadn't been crushed. Somehow, the stove had survived. Most of our gear didn't. We sat by the edge of the camp, huddled under a plastic tarp one of the hunters had in his pack. They shared dried meat with us. We gave them the last of our trail mix. There wasn't much said, just slow movements, heavy breathing, and quiet. In the morning, the jungle looked washed clean. Everything dripped. The air smelled like wet bark and dirt. Birds started calling out again. We packed what we could salvage into our bags. My girlfriend didn't say much. I didn't either. We were both thinking about the same thing, how close we'd come. The hunters walked with us for part of the way. They knew the trails better than we did, and without their guidance, we might have missed a few turns. They didn't ask for anything. They didn't act like they'd done us a favor. They were just there, When we reached a fork in the trail later that afternoon, they went one way and we went the other. A small nod was all we exchanged. We reached Tikal the following evening. The sight of the temples rising above the jungle canopy should have felt magical. Didn't. It felt like a place we'd earned, not through beauty, but survival. We checked into a basic shelter near the entrance. It had a roof and 4 walls. I'd never appreciated that more in my life. Looking back, I think a lot about those 2 guys. At first, they scared the hell out of me. They had weapons, they came out of nowhere, and we were in the worst possible place to meet strangers. But they turned out to be the reason we're alive. If they hadn't shown up, if we hadn't gotten out of that tent, I wouldn't be here writing this. They went from feeling like a threat to being the most helpful people we've ever met. Sometimes survival comes down to a tiny twist of timing, to a decision you don't even remember making. A sound in the night, a step outside, a second's hesitation, and then something crashes down where you used to be. I'll never forget that sound. The tree snapping, the weight of it hitting the earth. I still hear it sometimes, even now, back home, lying in my own bed. And I still feel the grip of her hand on my arm in that moment, tighter than anything I've ever known. We were lucky, that's all it was. Pure, dumb luck. But sometimes that's enough. I grew up not far from the border between 2 states where wildfires are a constant worry. People joke about the invisible lines that divide the land, the state boundaries marked by signs and roads that suddenly switch from one jurisdiction to another. When it comes to fires, though, those lines take on a kind of legend all their own. Everyone around here says the same thing in a half-joking way. Fire can't legally cross the border. I heard it so many times growing up that I never gave it much thought. Of course, fire isn't a citizen or a bureaucrat. It doesn't care about borders or signs. But there's a reason the saying exists. State and federal agencies divide responsibility and jurisdiction by those boundaries, and there are different rules, firefighting teams, and laws on either side. Sometimes the way the fire lines are drawn, or the resources available, make it feel like the fire just respects that line. I never really believed it until I saw something that shook me to the core on a solo camping trip last summer. I'm not the type to travel light or take shortcuts. When I camp, I like to carry enough gear to be safe but still stay mobile. My pack weighed about 35 pounds with a tent, sleeping bag, food for 4 days, water filter, clothes for cold nights, and my fire starting kit. I usually choose less popular spots, and this time I was heading deep into a national forest that straddles the state border. I was camped close enough to the boundary to cross it by foot in under an hour. The first 2 days were exactly how I expected, quiet, peaceful. The kind of place where you can hear your breath and the wind in the trees. No sounds of traffic, no other campers in sight. The forest floor was dry, but not dangerously so. Pine needles crisp and brown in places, but still full of life. Birds flitted from tree to tree. Small animals scurried in the underbrush. I made my camp near a small clearing by a creek that twisted through the woods like a silver thread. I chose this spot because it had fresh water and enough flat ground to set up a tent without too much hassle. I'd brought a good fire starter and a small axe to chop wood if needed. The evenings were cool, with stars so bright they looked fake. On the 3rd morning, I woke to an odd smell. Smoke. Not the smell of my own campfire, which I doused properly the night before, but something different, sharp, acrid, almost bitter. I grabbed my small binoculars and scanned the tree line to the north. There, just over a ridge, a column of smoke was rising. Thin at first, then thickening quickly. Flames were nowhere to be seen from my vantage point, but the smoke was darkening the sky. I packed up my camp quickly, deciding to hike toward the ridge to get a better view. The ground was dry, and a breeze was coming from the north, carrying the smoke directly toward me. My skin prickled as I realized the fire was bigger than I expected. I made my way up the slope carefully. The trail was steep and rocky, and the underbrush crackled under my boots. When I reached the top, I could see a massive line of fire burning through the forest about 3 miles away, eastward. The flames were bright and orange, jumping from tree to tree, feeding off the dry brush and fallen needles. But what caught my attention wasn't the fire itself. It was the line where the fire stopped. I knew the state border ran roughly along the ridge I was standing on. On the other side, the forest looked untouched, green and quiet. No smoke, no flames. It was almost surreal. The fire on my side roared and crackled like a living beast, but just a few hundred yards beyond that line, the forest was completely untouched. I pulled out my map and GPS to confirm. The fire was right up against the border, but it hadn't crossed it. I watched, fascinated and uneasy, as the fire continued to burn fiercely, pushing right to the edge but never stepping beyond. For hours, I stayed there, sweating and breathing the thick smoke through a damp bandana, watching that line. The sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the smoke in shades of red and gold. The fire was a terrifying wall of flame now, and the sky turned from blue to dark orange and then purple as the smoke thickened. I decided I had to move away from the ridge and find a safer place to camp for the night. But I didn't want to cross the border, not yet. I wasn't sure what would happen if I did. Down the slope, I found a small clearing and set up camp quickly, but the smell of smoke hung heavy in the air. I stayed close to my fire pit, just small embers to keep warm, making sure to keep water on hand. That night, the fire was louder, more insistent. The forest around me vibrated with its roar, like the earth itself was breathing fire. I felt small and exposed. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of burning wood and the crackling fire moving through the trees. At some point, I dozed off. I was woken by the sound of branches snapping nearby. My heart pounded as I sat up and shone my flashlight into the woods. For a long moment, nothing moved except the flicker of shadows in the smoke. But then I noticed something else. The fire on my side of the border was still raging, but the wind had shifted slightly. The smoke started drifting over the line. Slowly at first, a few embers floated across the border. Then small patches of flame began to catch on dry leaves and branches. The fire had crossed. It was breaking the rules. I grabbed my pack and moved fast, heading downhill toward the creek. The fire roared louder, and the wind pushed it harder. I could see flames licking higher up the trees now, and the heat was unbearable. The smoke choked the air. I ran as fast as I could through the underbrush, lungs burning, heart pounding. I stumbled over rocks and roots, tripping once and scraping my knee. When I reached the creek, I didn't hesitate. I stripped off my pack and dropped it on the bank, then plunged into the cold water. The creek was deeper than I expected, and the current was strong. I fought to keep my footing as I waded across to the other side. The water was freezing, and the shock of cold hit me hard. I climbed out, soaked and shivering, and looked back. The fire was moving fast. It was crossing the creek and eating the forest on the other side alive. The smoke was so thick I could barely see the sky. I realized I was trapped between the fire and the creek. The only way forward was to cross back over the fire line and find safety. I turned to run, dodging flames and falling branches. The heat was crushing, and the smoke made it impossible to breathe without gasping. My wet clothes offered little relief. I kept moving until I reached a small dirt road where a few trees had been cleared. I found a spot near the edge of the burned area and waited for hours, coughing and exhausted. The fire eventually slowed, starved for fuel where the land had already burned. When I finally made it out to a ranger station, I learned that the fire was the worst in decades, fueled by an unusually dry spring and high winds. The border between the states had long been treated as a kind of firewall by authorities, with firefighting resources allocated carefully to try to contain fires before they crossed. But this fire was different. It ignored the rules. It jumped over control lines and burned through dry brush regardless of human boundaries. I learned something important that day. Fire doesn't care about laws or borders. It doesn't respect signs or fences. It only respects fuel and weather. And sometimes, when conditions are right, it will cross any line people try to put in its way. The legend I'd grown up hearing, that fire can't legally cross the border, was just that, a legend. The fire burned hundreds of thousands of acres, consumed homes and lives, and left scars on the land that would take decades to heal. And for me, that trip taught something far scarier than any ghost story, that nature's power is beyond control. that when fire moves, it moves without mercy, and that sometimes the lines we think protect us mean nothing at all. I had always wondered if it was possible to just chill in a lake while a forest fire burned all around you. The idea kept circling in my mind like some kind of challenge, a test of nature's limits and my own sense of safety. People talk about wildfires like they're these unstoppable monsters, but water is different. It's the natural barrier. So I thought, if the fire came close enough, could I just get in the water and wait it out? Would I be safe, or would the fire find a way to get me anyway? That question haunted me for years. I had never seen a wildfire up close, not the kind that roars through trees and turns forests into ash in a matter of hours. But I'd heard the stories, seen the news footage. The smoke would choke the sky, the flames would leap tens of feet high, and the heat was said to be so intense it could melt plastic and crack rocks. I decided to find out for myself. Not because I was reckless, at least not entirely. I'm a camper and a hiker by nature, always looking for a little adventure in the wild. But this was different. I wanted to see how close I could get to a fire and what it really felt like to be trapped between flame and water. Last summer, a wildfire broke out in a large national forest not far from my home. The fire started in the afternoon after a long dry spell, a lightning strike or maybe careless human error. I never found out. It spread quickly. Within a few days, it had covered several thousand acres and was moving fast. The Forest Service closed many of the trails, but one area near a big, isolated lake remained accessible for a short time before the fire approached. I packed my gear with extra care: wetsuit, waterproof bag, plenty of water, some snacks, and my camping essentials. I drove early in the morning to the trailhead and started hiking into the forest. The air was heavy with smoke even then, the sky a dull orange-gray haze. I felt the heat on my skin as I got closer to the fire's edge. The hike was tough. The ground was dry and brittle, pine needles crackling under my boots. Every few minutes, I could hear the faint crackle of flames in the distance, the occasional pop of burning branches snapping. The smell of burning wood was sharp and bitter, making my eyes water. Birds and animals were silent or had fled, leaving an eerie stillness broken only by the sounds of the fire. I reached the lake just before sunset. It was a large, deep body of water nestled in a basin surrounded by dense forest on all sides. The surface was calm, reflecting the smoky sky in dark shades of red and orange. The trees on the far side of the lake were already blackened and charred, some still smoldering quietly. I set up my tent near the water's edge, as far from the woods as I could get. I lit a small campfire to cook some food but kept it low, knowing the danger all around. The wind had started to pick up, carrying smoke and ash across the water. I watched the flames flicker in the distance, growing taller and more violent as the fire moved closer. By midnight, the fire had edged closer to the lake. The roar of the flames was louder now, like a giant beast breathing fire. The heat was intense, even at this distance. I couldn't help but feel small and exposed. The air was thick with smoke, making it hard to breathe. My eyes burned and my throat felt raw. I wasn't stupid enough to stay out by the fire all night. I crawled into my tent and tried to sleep, but the heat and smoke made it impossible. I kept waking up, listening to the crackling and the distant sounds of trees falling. Around 3 a.m., the wind shifted suddenly. I woke up to the sound of a sharp crack and a rush of heat. Outside, the fire had jumped across a dry patch of land and was pushing toward the lake's edge. I grabbed my wetsuit and put it on quickly. The water would be my refuge, my only chance to avoid being burned alive. The flames were a few hundred yards away now, the roar deafening. I packed my dry bag tightly and headed for the water, feeling the heat on my back with every step. I slid into the lake. The water was cold, shockingly cold, and it burned away some of the heat from the fire. I swam away from the shore, putting as much distance as I could between myself and the burning forest. The flames roared behind me, lighting up the night with a terrible orange glow. I floated there, trying to stay calm, trying to breathe through the thick smoke that filled the air. The water was my shield, but I wasn't sure how long it would hold. Ash floated on the surface, and embers drifted down like deadly rain. The sky was an unnatural red, and the heat was so intense it felt like the air itself was on fire. The fire wasn't just burning trees. It was burning everything: shrubs, dry grass, the ground itself. Flames jumped from tree to tree, some trees collapsing into the water with loud splashes. The lake was my only escape, but the fire was relentless. Couldn't stay still. The cold water was numbing my limbs, and the smoke made it hard to breathe. I started swimming slowly, moving around the lake's edge where the fire had not yet reached. My mind raced with thoughts of what might happen next. Would the fire circle the lake and trap me? Would it send enough heat and embers to force me underwater? Would I be able to hold out until help arrived, or until the fire burned itself out? Hours passed like this, the fire burning all around, the water my only refuge. I watched as whole sections of forest went up in flames, the fire moving like a wave, unstoppable and fierce. Sometimes the wind would blow the fire toward me, and I'd duck under the water, holding my breath as the heat scorched the air above. At one point, I realized how dangerous the situation really was. The fire wasn't just a distant threat anymore, it was closing in. The wind shifted again, and flames shot out over the water like fingers trying to reach me. I remembered stories of people caught in wildfires, those who thought they could outrun the flames or hide in water, only to be overwhelmed by heat and smoke. I kept swimming, staying low, moving cautiously but steadily. The lake was my lifeline, but it was also a trap. I couldn't leave the water without facing the fire, and I couldn't stay forever without risking hypothermia or drowning. As dawn broke, the fire's roar began to die down. The wind shifted once more, carrying smoke away and allowing firefighters to get closer with their equipment. I saw helicopters flying overhead, dropping water on the worst parts of the blaze. Exhausted and soaked, I finally climbed out of the lake when it was safe. The shoreline was a mess of charred branches and ash, but the water had protected me. I spent the next few days hiking out carefully, watching the destruction the fire had left behind. The forest was unrecognizable, blackened and silent except for the occasional crack of burning wood. The fire had taken everything: trees, plants, animal homes. That experience changed how I think about fire and nature's power. Being in the water surrounded by burning forest was terrifying and humbling. I realized how small and vulnerable we are in the face of nature's force. And the answer to my question, could you just chill in the lake while the fire burns the trees around you? Yes, you can, but it's not a peaceful or safe refuge. It's a desperate, terrifying place where survival depends on luck, timing, and the faint hope that the fire won't trap you. Nature doesn't care about your plans or your questions. It moves on its own terms with power far beyond what we expect. And sometimes, the only choice you have is to be still in the cold water, surrounded by fire, hoping to make it out alive.